Good afternoon. Welcome to our live stream. My name is Drew Clark. I'm editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. Happy to welcome you to our Broadband Breakfast live online session for Wednesday, March 1st, 2023. We hope to be coming to you live from many platforms. We are on Zoom. We're also on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And that, of course, is appropriate because we're going to be talking today about the Big Tech and Speech Summit. That's coming up on Thursday, March 9th, just over a week from now. We have here with me in our Zoom room the other panelists, or I should say the other moderators for our Big Tech and Speech Summit. We've got a really incredible program lined up, and part of the purpose of this session here today on Broadband Breakfast and the other platforms is to get your interaction, your questions, your feedback for the moderators who will be at the sessions next week at Clydes of Gallery Place. Just for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are at Broadband Breakfast. We're a news and events company focused on, as we say, better broadband, better lives. We talk about the infrastructure, but we also talk about the applications and use, and of course, big tech, which is a major component of the broadband ecosystem. We do reporting, but we also do these events every Wednesday at 12 noon. Eastern time. We do this. We did one last week on workforce. We're doing one next week on tribal broadband. The week after on Delta Regional Authority and its work in broadband. But today, of course, we're focused on the summit. And again, for those of you who haven't heard about or seen the summit, you should go to broadbandbreakfast.com/BTSS, or just go to the Broadband Breakfast homepage and click on conferences. You'll see all about the conference. It is shaping up to be an impressive program, in part because of the moderators that you'll hear from just now, but also because of several addresses, special addresses that we're going to be hearing from as part of the program. We will be hearing from Adam Connor, who is the Vice President of Technology Policy at American Progress, Ellie Noem, who is a very established professor of economics and finance at the Columbia Business School and runs Columbia Institute of Teleinformation, and John Samples, Vice President of the Cato Institute, and also a member of Facebook's Independent Oversight Board. Those are three of the special addresses that we'll be hearing from during the Broadband Breakfast Big Tech and Speech Summit. But the core of the event is structured around 4 panels. And the first of these is the one I will be moderating. We're calling it The Big Picture for Big Tech. And obviously, we're here and we're going to be talking about this subject because the tech industry, which used to be sort of, both parties falling over themselves to embrace and praise, and now it's the opposite, right? Both parties are doing everything they can to attack and criticize. And what's next? Well, regulate, right? That's kind of on the agenda. And so the big picture on big tech, the session that I'll moderate first in the day will include Ellery Roberts Biddle of Coda Media, Steve Del Bianco of NetChoice, Will-Marie Escoto of Access Now, Amy Peikoff of Parler, and Dane Snowden of Wilkinson Barker Knauer, WBK, as it likes to call itself. And Dane, of course, comes from a background including head of the Internet Association, which represent a lot of these groups. I'm going to just now turn to our other moderators for panels 2, 3, and 4. Those sessions are on the fragility of Section 230, regulating data privacy, and innovation, competition, and future tech. And we've structured it. We didn't necessarily do this deliberately, but it kind of came together at the same time. President Joe Biden, he obviously has been critical of big tech, but he's recently gotten more critical and more vocal in his criticisms. He, for example, put forth an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal where he laid out, Section 230, big problem, needs to be fixed. Privacy, big problem, needs to be fixed. And antitrust and competition, big problem that needs to be fixed. And we just happen to have panels on each of these 3 topics. So I have more to say about kind of why we're coming to this point of doing this event, which I may kind of talk about throughout the discussion, but I don't want to let our other panelists wait too long. We're extremely grateful we'll be able to be with them in person next week. And again, the event is Thursday, March 9th. It's at Clyde's of Gallery Place in Washington. Registration is available for $299. You just go to broadbandbreakfast.com, click on the conferences, and you can see the updated list of the people, the moderators, their bios, and of course, a big, register now button. One more thing, big announcement today. We are also going to be making a live stream of this event available. All those who attend in person will also get the recording, the high quality recording of the event, but we're now making available a webinar or web stream, live stream of the event for $99 for those who are not in Washington, but would still like to be a part of this event. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our moderators for the session. We'll go in the order of the sessions after myself, Kathy Gellis, who is an attorney with and quite an expert in this topic of Section 230. She says that she was frustrated that people were making the law without asking her opinion. And so she moved away from a web development career to be an attorney. She's also she calls herself a former aspiring journalist and a longtime fan of civil liberties. And again, she's done an exceptional amount of work on the subject of Section 230. So we're going to hear from her first, and following her, we're going to hear from John Verdi. John is Senior Vice President of Public Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum, which is a global think tank based in Washington, but it doesn't limit its work to the United States, as I'm sure, John, you'll mention a little bit more. And John supervises the Future of Privacy Forum's policy portfolios, including data protection issues ranging from ad tech to AI. Again, John, welcome. Thank you for being a part of this discussion, as well as our program next Thursday. And batting cleanup will be our final moderator for the day, Sarah Morrison. Sarah is a senior reporter at Vox's Recode, where she covers data privacy, antitrust, and big tech's power over us all. Okay, isn't that very, very, very charming? And so Sarah also previously wrote about tech's impact on the world for Vocative, and she's also been published in Atlantic, Jezebel, Neiman Reports, and the Columbia Journalism Review. Thank you to each of you. Let's go ahead and turn it over to you. Kathy, tell us a little bit about the state of Section 230, what you're hoping to come out of the panel, and maybe some open questions that you have in your mind that our audience can weigh in on. Make sure you're unmuted, please. Thanks.
Yes. So hello from team. Section 230 is a good law, and we'd be in trouble if we didn't have it. So when I look at the landscape, the concern I have is that people don't like it, but a lot of the reason they don't like it is because they really don't understand it. There are a lot of myths about Section 230, what it does, how it works, what it helps, what it does, what it doesn't do. And those myths tend to fuel the hostility, which then turns into attempts to change the law, either through the courts or through politics. And this is a problem, because if it's not understood, then we risk breaking something that we'd actually really prefer not to break. Everything that Section 230 does to enable innovation, to enable online expression, to try to make sure that we have the healthiest online ecosystem as possible. When we look at it and we see that, well, there are obviously problems, it's not to say that it's Section 230's fault that there are problems, that Section 230 gives us the chance to have the best potential, and that maybe if there's issues on the side, we should be looking at other areas of regulation and looking at a fellow panelist. Perhaps privacy is one avenue that we should look at more closely. So I think with the point of the panel, we'd be best served by addressing what some of those myths are, not perpetuating those myths, and really helping provide more of an educational background in terms of what does this law do, why it feels so unintuitive to people, but also what its strength is and what we'd risk if we even changed it, let alone repeal it, because sometimes the changes that are proposed, even if they may seem small, end up being something that would catastrophically obliterate its benefit. And so I think it would be better if we didn't do that. And so we'll see where the conversation goes in terms of hopefully everybody is on board that we shouldn't break things. But I think it's important to understand how our interaction with this statute and any other ancillary regulation would all play out.
Let me ask you a quick question, Kathy. Obviously, you're coming to this and being the moderator of a session where there's going to be different points of view on it. Do you think that there's become any greater rigor or heft to any of the arguments against Section 230? Or let me broaden that a bit. Put aside Section 230 and speak about the California and Texas laws, which obviously will impact content moderation. What is your take on those, and what are some of the things that you're hoping will come out of this discussion at Big Tech and Speech Summit?
The problem that we have is that the bad things do happen on the internet because not everybody uses their ability to speak to each other in a positive and productive way. And when we look at the harms, and there's instances where there can be a lot of harm, severe harm, and I think some of my panelists will be people who are very, very, very focused on the harms. And with that sort of very specific focus on something bad happened and something must be done, that's all valid and careful. The question is what should be done, and that the reflex to say, well, if Section 230 made the internet, and the internet is, and there's bad things on the internet, that I guess Section 230 might be a bad law we need to revisit. That is not necessarily the applicable math, but we could look at what the actual problems are that we're objecting to, and perhaps look at what else we could do alongside without wrecking the part that's actually working, because sometimes what happens is Section 230 is actually forestalling even greater harm, even particularly the harms that we're actually looking at right now. And this desire to sort of manually control it is something that may seem like the right thing to do, but would actually be counterproductive.
Okay, great. Thank you. And let's definitely hear from some of the people participating in the discussion in this Broadband Breakfast Live online session, and we'll look forward to that. Let's go ahead and turn it over to you, John. Tell us a little bit about the Future of Privacy Forum and some of the debates that you've been a part of with regard to privacy and how they're impacted now in the context of what we're talking about at the Big Tech and Speech Summit.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is John Verdi. I work at the Future Privacy Forum with a fantastic team of subject matter experts. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C. with offices elsewhere around the world. And we work on a lot of the issues that intersect with how consumers and individuals interact with technology and data, how their data is protected, how it's not protected, how connected services benefit individuals and communities and society, and at the same time, how those same services can create real risks, often significant risks, for those same individuals and communities and society at large, and what the best ways are to help mitigate those risks. And I got to tell you, right now, the policymaker conversation with lawmakers and regulators in Washington, D.C. and around the United States is centering on new rules and laws to try to mitigate and curtail some of those data protection risks. We see this obviously coming out of California a number of years ago, which kicked off a much greater and more active legislative push in many states, and that has continued through the state legislative sessions at the beginning of this year. We've also seen that at the federal level. Just this morning, House Commerce, the relevant subcommittee, held a hearing to primarily introduce new members to the important issues around consumer data protection, and also to solidify that subcommittee's approach to reintroducing and potentially modifying the ADPPA, which was the leading federal privacy bill that was considered last term. So we see lots of activities in the states, sometimes centering around kids' privacy or young people's privacy, sometimes centering around health privacy, or often centering around comprehensive privacy regulation and legislation to impose requirements on companies and give rights to individuals for a whole range of data collection, sharing, and use practices. We also see activity at the federal level, both on the comprehensive front with ADPPA and also in some sectoral areas. Congress has been interested in past sessions on issues like biometric privacy or student privacy. A lot to understand and appreciate, a lot of activity at the Federal Trade Commission, perhaps some at the Federal Communications Commission moving forward. Certainly a lot to talk about. And it's a great pleasure for me to be able to have this conversation next week with some of the experts in the field, from who many of whom have widely varying perspectives on these issues and what the appropriate approach is moving forward. I think we're going to have a rollicking conversation.
Awesome. You know, in terms of privacy, John, do you see there being, like, what's your diagnosis for why the privacy legislation didn't pass in 2022? And do you think it's a shoo-in for this year, or are there lots of hurdles to overcome all over again?
So the quick analysis that I think most accurately describes why the bill did not pass last session is that bipartisan leadership were unable to come to a workable compromise. I don't believe that it is an issue of folks in Congress not having the appreciation for the fact that data protection issues and privacy issues are important issues. I don't think the failure to pass arose from a lack of hard work at the staff level to try to get to that workable compromise. It really is, in my view, at this point, individuals in Congress, congressmen and congresswomen, senators in both houses, needing to come together and address some of the very real political controversies that are raised by privacy legislation. And some of these controversies involve issues like federal preemption. To what extent would a federal bill render ineffective or inapplicable state laws that have been passed in California and elsewhere that regulate privacy today? I think there's broad bipartisan agreement that there are some state laws that no one intends to preempt. I think there's also disagreement amongst members and political constituencies about the extent to which some laws ought to be preempted. And I think that we're going to have broad disagreement amongst our discussants and our panelists next week about whether preemption is appropriate at all, and if so, to what extent. So that's just one issue that I think drove some of the disagreement amongst members of Congress. You asked me whether or not I believe that bill is a shoo-in. I would hesitate to characterize any bill presented to Congress in this political environment as a shoo-in for anything. So I'm going to demur on that one. I would say that I think there has been a tremendous amount of good and constructive negotiation done on the core issues, both last year and in between sessions. Whether that will bear fruit in terms of a bipartisan vote, which is what I think it's going to take to get a bill like this through both houses into the president's desk, remains to be seen.
Great. Thank you. Let's now turn to Sarah. Tell us a little bit about this next area, which on which there clearly is not agreement. What's your? I mean, there's just been so much activity on this front involving antitrust and innovation. Tell us how you view the way the landscape stands right now.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year for innovation, competition, and future tech. We saw potential antitrust legislation that mostly targeted big tech practices come and then go. It doesn't seem likely that'll be revived in this split Congress, at least not in the form that it was in. And at the same time, some of the arguments about why big tech should be subject to antitrust laws may have gotten weaker. These companies aren't, doing as well as they were even just a year ago. Stock prices and layoffs are anything to go by, which you can debate whether they are or not, but they're there. And we have things like TikTok which show that these companies maybe don't have this total dominance or stranglehold over certain markets that we maybe thought they did. And then in terms of innovation, it's probably maybe move past the metaverse for now, but we do have generative AI had sort of a coming out party last year with these sort of image and text generators. OpenAI, sort of ChatGPT is probably the most well known at this point. They've sort of become widely available for the public to actually try. We're seeing them now this year integrated into products that we actually use, specifically internet search. And new technologies are usually where new companies emerge and grow. But again, OpenAI, which is kind of leader in this space, has a significant partnership with Microsoft worth at this point, I think $13 billion. Google and Meta have their own generative AI chatbots and initiatives, in the works and have been in the works for years. So it'll be interesting to see, if they're able to maintain that power and dominance with the emergence of a technology that really seems to need significant capital investments to get to the level where it's ready for us to even use. So, the question is, can smaller companies even compete at this point? Will history repeat itself where we allow like certain companies to, become super powerful over spaces that, all of us interact with all the time? And, while we're against this sort of backdrop of, innovation, we have an administration that has said and issued executive orders to the effect of, we need to do something to promote competition, especially in digital and big tech spaces, because competition promotes innovation and, we're not seeing enough of it. So, if you have the entire search market, are you going to put significant resources into innovating it, or the digital ad space or mobile devices? Are you powerful and rich enough to buy up or quash, upcoming competition? As impressive as the, sort of generative AI stuff we're seeing now is, could we have had more sooner if these companies were, more inclined to innovate, in order to compete, or if they were smaller ones were able to? And then, how will we regulate all of these new things, or the things that we have in existence that some of us have been trying to regulate already? I mean, should we, can we? There's a consensus, I think, in DC, or somewhat of one, that, something should change, something should be done. What and why has been, I think, very different. So I guess, I want to focus on or look at like, have these feelings changed at all with the weakening or seeming weakening of the established policy manager for Proton, which is like, I get this point, a suite of apps that puts a sort of privacy sort of at the forefront. It's one of their big selling points. Cheyenne Hunt Major, the big tech accountability advocate for Public Citizen. Adam Kovakovich, the CEO of Chamber of Progress. And Baron Zoka. I think I'm pronouncing all these names correctly. If I'm not, I will next week. Tech Freedom Foundation. And,
That's awesome.
yeah, and we'll see how it goes.
No, that's awesome. Thank you for being with us both now and next week. We want to encourage, your questions. It does appear that our live stream is working on all the platforms. So we will look forward to taking your questions now, both on Zoom and the other platforms. As we gear towards that, let me just kind of say a few words about the conference itself. We've done a freestanding conference of our own last year at same location, Clydesdale Gallery Place. It was on digital infrastructure investment. We'll be doing another conference in June on broadband implementation. This is our first conference on this topic, though. And we very actively cover and write about the Section 230 debate. Kathy's been on our program before a couple of times. As we thought about, well, what are the issues driving big tech and speech? We realized, privacy and competition are like elephants in the room, right? I mean, there's so, and Kathy sort of alluded to this a little bit earlier on, there's so many points of view around Section 230. There's people who think that the tech industry is censoring conservative content or certain types of content. And so in some ways, the Texas and Florida measures are the lights go off here. The Texas and Florida measures are a response to that, because they, as I understand them, and Kathy, correct me if I'm wrong, they would require platforms to allow content on their sites that they would otherwise take off for various reasons, right? And so that's one perspective you hear a lot from. There's also others who think that tech is just allowing too much misinformation or harmful content that is causing harms to social media, through social media, to people, to teens, and to many others. This is kind of the most recent flap we've heard in Washington around social media and speech, and of course privacy is in this mix, right? I mean, the tech ecosystem has been built around this model of data mining individual information, and so you go to events where people criticize big tech, and some of the Section 230 events, they point their fingers and say, look, if you've got a problem, go address privacy or competition, right? And then you go to the privacy events and people say, oh yes, okay, well, we certainly need good privacy, but don't try to infect privacy policy by what your concerns are about content or about antitrust. And then you go to the antitrust events and they say, yes, I mean, maybe policymakers in Washington should deal with Section 230 and privacy issues, but make sure that the antitrust laws are kept on a consumer welfare standard, and make sure there's a demonstration of harm against technology companies before we go after them. So it's kind of like each of these little domains wants to keep their own little area apart from the others. And that's why we at Broadband Breakfast said we really need to consider these topics together. And so I'd actually like to hear from each of you, from Kathy and John and Sarah, about that kind of, segmentation of issues and communities, or does it make sense? Does it necessarily make sense to consider all these issues together? Kathy.
I've actually been critical in other contexts of the siloization of tech policy, because every silo, and every time anybody in the silo tries to solve a problem, they don't necessarily realize the collateral consequences that there'll be on other silos, because they're so focused on their area of expertise. I think also we end up in echo chambers where, and I'm just throwing this out as a topic, like the privacy people are talking to the privacy people all the time. The cybersecurity people are talking to cybersecurity people all the time. The copyright people are talking to the copyright people all the time. But if you move in one domain, like in copyright, you're going to have implications on the privacy realm without necessarily realizing it. So I'm definitely a fan of interdisciplinary approaches to solving technology policy problems, because it's a one large problem and there's a lot of different puzzle pieces that go together. The caution is diluting the focus. We still have to be focused on good problem definition and good solution creation. And the more cooks you have in the kitchen, the soup could be brilliant or the soup could go crazy. So you still have to be careful and disciplined in how you actually analyze things. But the interdisciplinary approaches to tech policy problems absolutely seems like a good idea, because I think we suffer when we try to do things too separate from the other areas where we're going to have impact with anything we do in another area.
Thanks, John. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Couldn't agree more. Absolutely important to have this sort of interdisciplinary conversation when one moves one lever or turns one wrench on intermediary immunity, something happens over on data protection and privacy. And when one contemplates a solution to a particular challenge, whether it's legislative or regulatory privacy space, there could be implications for competition policy. So I think having a big tent and looking at these tech policy questions broadly, and I know, it's a broadband breakfast, so I know you like to look at things broadly. Absolutely thrilled to have more voices in the conversation rather than fewer.
Sarah.
So actually, some of the argument that I've heard from, a lot of antitrust advocates, I think including Lena Khan, in a couple of her papers, is that antitrust legislation that like limits big tech's power will then also solve some of the big issues around privacy and content moderation, because if you can compete more, you can use things like privacy in order to have like a selling point, or if you don't have to compete, then you can do worse things to your consumers' privacy. They sort of cite like Meta buying Instagram and like reducing sort of privacy protections as one of those examples of that. Others think it's a little too maybe optimistic to think that one thing can then solve all of these problems. But that is an argument that I've heard. And then, on the other side, again, I've heard that when, you focus on antitrust and sort of assume that that'll work everything else that's wrong with big tech out, you're then missing or not putting resources or time into the things like on a, more siloed level. And then we're not getting like privacy legislation. We're not looking enough or as much as people think we should at reforming Section 230. So, like I said, I've heard points made from both sides, not sure which is right. We're not doing anything about any of these things right now. So,
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and take those questions that we do have here. And again, we are on all the platforms. We can see questions to LinkedIn, to Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, and of course, Zoom. We have a question here from Daniel Smith, who says, I suggest that if you serve ads with feeds, you are responsible for the content. Okay, let's actually consider that for a moment. Kathy, what are your thoughts on that? And how do you think this issue might play into the discussion at the Big Tech and Speech Summit on March 9th?
So as a matter of law, from a Section 230 perspective, no, Section 230 would not allow liability for ads, basically because ad content is being created by a third party, and the distinction between what a user, as we think, like let's think in Facebook terms, just as an example, what we think of as content created by a user is really the same thing as content created by a user who pays to have their content put there. It's still a third party, and the platform is really not dispositive for purposes of Section 230. So as a matter of law, no, I don't think a platform could be held liable for the content of ads. But as a matter of, is that also the right policy? I think the answer is yes, because one of the things that happened with internet advertising that didn't happen offline, and for better or for worse, is it made advertising something that was available to far more people with far more businesses with far less money, as opposed to if you're dealing with some of the offline examples and you've only got so many pages in the newspaper or so many minutes of TV and radio time to sell ads for, you don't get, there's not as many players who can avail themselves of the opportunity to provide their advertising content and reach customers. So then you also see consolidation in other markets. Whereas with the internet, this is something that, small businesses have access to, individual users have access to, because it doesn't take the budget to be able to get the exposure, because platforms have more eyeballs that they can ultimately connect to, and there's more space and more opportunity and lower rates that you can sell into. So sometimes there's byproducts to that, but I think overall it's been good for the economic ecosystem of America and helped also fuel. It's not just that the innovation economy it has blossomed in 25 years, but also ancillary businesses that have also thrived.
I actually am curious as to Sarah and John's take on this question, but I want to just mention another thing about the summit on March 9th coming up. We mentioned at the top the three special addresses that we will be hearing from Adam Connor, Ellie Nome, and John Samples. I also want to highlight two of the sponsors for the Big Tech and Speech Summit. They are NetChoice and Texas.net. And NetChoice is, of course, a plaintiff in the Texas and Florida lawsuit cases. And Texas.net, by contrast, is a huge defender of the Texas statute. So that'll obviously lead to some interesting discussions at the event. And in fact, Andrew McFarlane of Texas.net has put in a question in the chat here. He says, what does responsible for mean? I think this is referring to the question, if you serve ads with feeds, you are responsible for the content. And Dan Smith in real time is answering, it's not so much the content of the ads, but the social medium is monetizing the associated post. So let's just see if there's more discussion on this point about holding a content provider responsible for advertisement. I would love to hear from John and Sarah. Do you have thoughts on this question?
I mean, I'm Section 230. I mean, I'm an unbiased journalist, but I do think Section 230 has been a good thing for the internet. And I think, you know, changing it at all comes with a lot of unintended consequences. And so if that's what we're getting at in terms of like making, you know, platforms, social media companies responsible for the things that third parties put on them, including ads, I don't know that that's such a good idea. But it is tricky when you do see these platforms getting a lot of money from the ads on them, and they not being, you know, not doing enough to take down things that, you know, are false or go to, you know, like websites that are scamming people, you know, and things like that. And then they have, you know, a real financial interest in not doing that. And there's sort of, you know, it comes down to like, you know, the market is supposed to be the ones, you know, who say, well, I don't want to use a platform that I see a bunch of like scam ads on that, you know, so I'll go somewhere else. And then where else do you go when some of these sites are just kind of the only places you can, one of the few places you can. So, you know, it's a tricky question, but, you know, overall, I don't know that we want to make, you know, these sites responsible for like all the things that are in the ads, even though they make money off of those ads.
Thank you, John. Do you have any thoughts on this question?
I think folks' answers to these questions depend in large part on their prior view of online platforms, the online ecosystem and services that all of us use today. And I think folks who view those online platforms, who view those online services as largely beneficial to themselves, to their colleagues, to their friends, to communities and society as a whole, would look at the notion of holding platforms or services responsible for advertising content as challenging. Because I think inevitably that level of responsibility undermines the business model and business practices that support free content on the internet today. To the extent that folks look at the current internet business model of ad-supported content and say, it is a bad thing. It's bad for teenagers' mental health. It's bad for competition. It's bad for a variety of other democratic or social principles that they would view holding platforms or services responsible for the content of advertisements as a positive thing, because it would undermine those very same services. So I think it depends on your priors. And one of the things that I try to be really clear about when I chat with folks about these issues is when you come to an analysis of online services and internet connected technologies, do you think that they are by and large a good thing for the world, and regulators ought to fiddle around the edges and mitigate some of the risks and make good things better and make bad things less bad? Or do you come to it with a view of the world that says online connected services and internet-based technologies have largely been a net negative for society, and we ought to radically reform how they look today? And I think depending on where folks fall on that spectrum, because it's not a binary, it's not two different buckets, there's a spectrum of views in between. I think it really can tell you a lot about how they will view questions about 230, questions about online privacy regulation, questions about competition policy.
Mhm. I mean, I just put in the chat stream for those who are watching via Zoom, a recent article on broadband breakfast. Bipartisan alarm over social media's harms to children prompts a slew of proposed legislation. And, you know, as our reporter M. McPhee wrote in this story, I mean, there really was a very, this is just over a week ago, a very strong consensus almost emerging that tech is not doing enough on you know, online harms to young people. Let's kind of dwell in this a little bit more. So if you assume, if you agree with that premise that tech is not doing enough to, you know, shield, let's just say, you know, teenagers from online media harms. Well, okay, what's your take on that? Like, what's the take from the Section 230 world? What's the take from the privacy world? What's the take from the antitrust world? What do each of those domains say to this, again, hypothesis we're going to take for the moment? What should be done in those various fields if you agree that this is a problem? Again, let's hear from Kathy, John, and Sarah.
I think if the question is, could they do more? The answer might be yes, but could they do as much as being demanded? The practical answer may be no. The practical answer may be that thanks to Section 230 freeing the hands of platforms to do the best they can, and also making it possible that a platform that could potentially do it better can also come along and steal their thunder and provide platform services better, is it is, I think, fundamental. So it's not to say that everything is, I don't defend the statute by saying everything is perfect and wonderful, la, 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 I can't hear you, that there's any particular externalities that we might not lament. But I think the point is, and what is the fix for that? People may have unrealistic expectations about what a platform should do, and certainly unrealistic expectations about what changing Section 230 would do vis-a-vis the things we're upset about. Because I put to you that changing it, or even trying to finesse it around the edges a little bit, could be absolutely devastating to, not only will it not solve the problem, it may make the problems worse, because it's also going to take away all the ability for the internet to be able to provide benefit. And even if we're speaking in the context of younger people, they do get benefits from the internet. And I think what people want is like the bad stuff to go away, but the good stuff to stick around. But if you're going to prescribe policy around that, you have to make sure that's the effect. And every time the sights are set on Section 230, they really risk killing the golden goose. And I don't think people quite recognize that to the degree that they need to before they actually do in the goose.
John, what's your reaction to the hypothesized question?
Sure. So two things. One, I too would like the good stuff to stick around and the bad stuff to go away. But my freshman year philosophy class taught me that what I think is the good stuff and what I think is the bad stuff, there may not be broad consensus on. And I think some of the work that Congress is doing right now in the privacy space, in the Section 230 space, and the competition space, is trying to find where that area of consensus is. The broad social consensus about what is good and what is bad, and how policymakers ought to react. Second point is on the specific issue that you raised, Drew, which is young folks and social media. All of this is a continuum, right? There are some folks in the privacy conversation and the tech policy conversation right now who would argue that there is nothing to be done or nothing should be done in order to modify the impact of social media on young people. That's way over here in terms of an argument, but some folks make that argument and hold that view. All the way at the other end are, just to take an example, some of our friends who are in the Utah legislature who would like to wholly ban social media for young people. Full stop. Not ban it without parental consent, not ban it in many circumstances, but just ban it. And that's their estimation. And that view is all the way over here. And in the middle, there are a lot of different views and a lot of different policy options when it comes to addressing these things. Some folks woke up this morning and got a notice in their feed that said TikTok, one of the most popular social media sites for young people, has implemented a default 1 hour screen time limit for their app for young folks. Now, this default limit can be modified if young folks want to engage with more TikTok content than 1 hour a day. But it is a design feature intended to address some of the concerns about technology addiction or screen time for young folks. Now, where does that action by a large technology platform fall on the spectrum of nothing should be done versus it should be banned? Well, it falls somewhere in the middle. And there are a whole lot of other solutions that we might bring to bear to address some of these issues.
Sarah, what about the antitrust angle on this?
I mean, again, that just keeps going to like, well, if, there's more competition, then, there'd be more options, and some of them would be, better for kids. And I guess some of them would be worse. I will say, in my reporting, one of the things that I kind of bump up against a lot is like, well, if we want to regulate like the digital space in ways that like antitrust legislation, I guess, would, well, who does that? The FCC regulates like broadcast and radio. We don't have an FCC really for the internet in the same way, and we sort of refuse to make an additional agency that maybe would be able to do that in a way that was sort of more fluid. And I don't know there's much of an appetite again to do that. So we sort of have to, I guess, rely on Congress, a very slow Congress, to pass tiny like laws, and then we can't really adjust them quickly as maybe we need to. I will say, I've written a little bit about this, that, when we do these laws that are supposed to help kids with the internet, you can end up having things that are actually worse for privacy because you have to verify ages. How do you do that? You have to know someone is. So now we have like, biographical information about like kids and also everybody, because you have to prove you're not a kid. And how well these companies protect all that information that they're going to collect? Not well. As the 75 notices I get from every single company I interact with having a data breach can indicate. And then on the other hand, laws that are meant to help kids from content on the internet is how Section 230 actually happened in the first place, which we forget because all the stuff around it about kids not seeing porn went away.
Bring that in. That was one of the things I wanted to raise, is the irony here that, that Section 230 was the thing that survived after the Communications Decency Act collapsed.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's Kathy, actually, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Sarah. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure, Kathy, knows what can say more about this than I can, but like basically, as seems to consistently happen, Congress got real scared about the internet and kids seeing naked people in porn. And so they tried to regulate it and say, people under certain age, like, websites couldn't, make, that material available to them. And then again, that was struck down, almost all of that for being a free speech violation. One of the amendments that kind of snuck in and that survived again is Section 230. And that's the internet that we have today.
Kathy, do you want to add anything to this point about are we back to the same world where it's a concern about online content or on the length of online content that's sort of driving people to try to use Section 230 to deal with? I mean, it was put in place obviously to give a good Samaritan safe harbor for tech companies that wanted to take material down from their sites and services, but not be subject to the requirements of a censorship focused law. Kathy, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so the thing that we're kind of skipping over, and I think some of the Section 230 discussions to its detriment skip over, like everyone's like, oh, it's only Section 230 holding up the internet. But that's not exactly true. The First Amendment is the thing that is most heavily operated here. It's also why, to answer Sarah's point of like why we don't have an agency that can regulate content on the internet, because it would be unconstitutional to have a government agency regulate the content on the internet. Because also what John pointed out is we don't all agree of what the good stuff and the bad stuff is. And this is why the First Amendment says the government gets out of the business. The exception for the FCC is because spectrum was limited. That sort of became the sort of how the First Amendment got a little bit rooted around. Because spectrum was limited, the government in theory could have the ability to sort of just allocate it more effectively, and on that basis it got to put a thumb on the scales of what was actually going over the air. But that's not true for the internet, where we don't have limited spectrum. It's essentially unlimited, and the government doesn't get to be involved. So that's kind of why 230 is the one piece of the Communications Decency Act that survived, because it was the one bit where the government couldn't come in and say, this content can be up and this content could be down. So the best that Congress could do is sort of say, okay, look, platforms, you as private entities with your own editorial discretion can make decisions, and we're going to make it safe for you to make those decisions, and be specific in our statutory language that we're trying to be. We want you to facilitate the most good stuff and to also eliminate the most of the bad stuff. But because we can't be prescriptive, we just have to make it that you are able to do the best that you can, because you have the regulatory flexibility to be able to do the best that you can. So the irony, as you pointed out, was since the government can't make the rules directly and impose its will, the best it can do is animate private actors to, as they exercise their own will, do the best they can. And some platforms are going to choose things that we will like more than others will choose stuff that we don't like, but that's kind of the way it works in the marketplace of ideas. And in the wake of the First Amendment, that's the way it has to work, because it's going to give us the best results overall, including for the hygiene and what we care about our kids getting exposed to.
John's mention of TikTok earlier on kind of brings an issue to bear, which is, here you have a player, TikTok, that, kind of rocketed to ready availability and growth. And now it's, of course, under huge pressure because of its ownership by a Chinese holding company. Could you speak, all of you speak to, are the tech social media platforms operating in lockstep, or are they really kind of competing with different angles? And I mean, again, I hadn't heard this, John, until you mentioned it about TikTok's default screen time limit of 1 hour, but that does sound like an innovative development that's probably not coming at the same way that, Google's YouTube or Twitter or Facebook or Parler or any of the others are. So what are your thoughts on competition among social networks, and whether they are sort of, at playing nice in a bad way, or whether they are really kind of going head to head again for everyone, Sarah, John, and Kathy?
On the privacy side, just very briefly, I'd say I think that you see several companies competing, rolling out new features, and trying to address concerns raised by their users. At the same time, though, let's be clear. There is a pretty solid consensus amongst the largest global technology companies about what data is actually most top of mind for consumers. Things like location data, things like young folks data, things like health data. And there has been an emerging consensus about the appropriateness of heightened protections for that sort of data. So it's a bit of a mix. You certainly see companies competing on privacy features. Apple, I think, is a notable example that isn't just competing on privacy features, but advertising and promoting the fact that they are competing on privacy features. But you also see a growing consensus and growing norms from some of these platforms and some of these larger companies, and many small companies as well, as to what data, what information, and in which context there should be heightened safeguards.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not exactly sure of the specifics, but I believe the EU has some laws coming up that they've passed that would force these companies to institute, I think, more kinds of controls, parental controls for kids under a certain age. So what TikTok is doing is, I think, where things are kind of going. I'm actually writing about this screen time limit thing right now. The interesting thing about it is that's kind of not a limit. It's just a suggestion. If you're like 13 to 17, you can just, enter a code or make your own like limit. And, but it is also just indicative of how TikTok is in a slightly different space than these other American companies, and that they have to look as good and proactive as possible because everyone's trying to ban them. And that's sort of not the case for Meta. So I think TikTok's trying to get out in front of all the things it can as much as possible, sort of put on a good show. And that might be sort of a motivation behind some of the announcement today.
We'll let Kathy weigh in, but I do want to just highlight, I think Sarah mentioned the people on the panel. I myself neglected, we have on panel one, in addition to myself, we have Ellery, Robert Spittle of Coda Story, Steve Del Bianco of NetChoice, Will Murray Escuto of Access Now, Amy Peikoff of Parler, and Dane Snowden of WBK. On the panel two, Kathy's panel, we have Matthew Bergman of the Social Media Victims Law Center. Okay, so it brings a really interesting perspective. Ashley Johnson of Information Technology Innovation Foundation, Emma Lanzo, I hope I got that right, Emma, on the Free Expression Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology, Chris Marchese of NetChoice, and Ron Jokubaitis of Texas.net. On the privacy panel that John is moderating, we have Alan Butler, the Executive Director of Electronic Privacy Information Center, Sarah Collins of Public Knowledge, India McKinney of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Shane Tews of America Enterprise Institute, and Alyssa Valatin of the National Urban League. So, and again, Sarah, you mentioned your diversity of panelists earlier on. I want to give each of you a chance to kind of close out with any of the thoughts of what you're looking to learn from these panelists on your summits. We also got a comment from Deborah Doyle about watch what various legislatures are doing on to school and public libraries. They will be looking at the digital space. And Dan Smith has also noted that social media is different from the phone system, where Ma Bell could not know the contents of the call, or at least it didn't normally know the contents of the call until we suddenly got to a world where they could record contents. But anyway, putting that deep privacy aside, let's hear final thoughts from each of them, each of you, our panelists. Let's hear Kathy first, John, and then Sarah. What are some of the questions you're looking to get answers to from the panel that each of you will be moderating? Kathy.
People who are focused on the problems, I'd like more insight into how they see the problem, define the problem, and assess the pressures that are operating on the problem. Because I do not think that changing Section 230 is the fix, but it would be helpful to know what's broken, because that will help us figure out what might be the fix.
Thank you, John.
Given the amount of proposed legislation, proposed regulation in the privacy space, I'm deeply interested in what the wide diversity of views are going to be from our panelists about the likely efficacy of those sorts of proposals, and where we might see a core consensus around many of the aspects of these important issues.
Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to know, like, where is antitrust and competition policy kind of going, how it's changed now that, again, the landscape has changed a little bit. And then what are we looking at in terms of like competition policy and AI? I mean, like, is this a chance to be maybe more proactive than reactive, which is kind of what we're, being right now, with, I guess, Web 2.0. So yeah, it's sort of, have their feelings or opinions about where we need to be changed at all? And what are they in terms of what the future is?
Well, thank you to each of you, as well as our audience on different platforms. A reminder that this preview session is available instantly afterwards on Broadband Breakfast. You can watch it. We obviously have links to the conference, the Big Tech and Speech Summit, coming up in 8 days at Clydes of Gallery Place in Washington. Register for that for $2.99. And you get 2 months of membership in the Broadband Breakfast Club. And again, today we've just announced that we will be live streaming it, and you can register for that at the same link. On behalf of our moderators, who we'll see again in a week's time, Kathy, John, and Sarah, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. We'll see you next week and hopefully next Thursday. Take care, everybody.